Tonight, we want to open dusty chronicles to list the names of kings or count the battles carved into stone. Instead, we'll follow the first thin ribbons of smoke rising from fires where no maps yet existed, where the air smelled of resin, salt, and something older than memory. It begins in the hands of shamans who breathed prayers into the dusk, their words curling upward like an offering the wind agreed to carry. It crosses wide rivers where canoes moved slower than the stories they told. It slips into villages where each ember in the fire pit held a secret, where smoke meant medicine or magic, or sometimes the thin border between the living and the spirits that walked beside them. Then the same curl of gray drifts across oceans with sailors who packed leaves into barrels without knowing they were loading a future empire. It climbs the walls of European palaces where kings wrote laws about a habit they could not put down, where courtiers exhaled fashion into painted air. By the time it winds through the chimneys of the industrial age, smoke carries with it centuries of ritual, obsession, and quiet rebellion breathing, always breathing through every law and prayer and banquet it ever passed. So lower the lights. Let the smoke drift slowly through the centuries with us. And if stories like this keep you company on quiet nights, you might consider subscribing. Share the time and place you're listening from. Perhaps the next campfire will be waiting for you there. And when it burns low, the trail will keep going past the first pipes carved from clay, past the caravels with barrels stacked like promises, past the royal courts where law and vanity shared the same breath. Each place adds its own shade to the smoke so that by the time it drifts into the modern age, it carries not just the scent of leaves, but the weight of everything people asked fire to remember for them. It is remarkable how much history fits inside a single curl of smoke. It looks empty, but it carries recipes, prayers, taxes, and a surprising number of pocket-sized boxes. The trail winds through the first fires where tobacco met ritual, across oceans on caravels heavy with barrels, into royal courts where kings outlawed smoke in the morning and indulged it by night. It lingers in marketplaces, in the corners of theaters, in the pockets of soldiers weaving its gray, ribbon through centuries of law vanity medicine, an addiction till it finally reaches the laboratories and warning labels of the modern age, still curling upward as if history itself were exhaling. Long before smoke was a habit, it was treated like a visitor. In forests from the Caribbean to the upper plains, people gathered in circles and made the air visible on purpose. They packed the plant into bowls carved from stone that felt cool in the morning and warm after everything had finished. The first smokes were not rushed. They were measured like steps in a ceremony. Some called it holy breath. The pipe was a door handle, not a toy. Smoke went up, the words went up with it, and a conversation began with whatever was listening. The tobacco itself had personalities. Some was gentle, grown in sand and named after the wind that touched it. Some was intense, the kind that made new initiates cough in ways that elders would describe as educational. A pinch of ashes could seal a promise, and a single leaf folded under the tongue might help a hunter remember the way home. The bowls of those early pipes were sometimes carved with tidy faces, so you had to tip them politely before you began. You can imagine the shape of the room, a simple circle of people and a circle of smoke, because circles are what humans do when they want to say that time is taking a seat with them. Medicine was not kept in cabinets then. It was carried in pouches with beadwork that told you who had made it and who had given it. Tobacco was in there as a concentrate of comfort. It tightened loose thoughts and loosened tight ones. For toothache, a quick roll of leaf, warmed by the fire, pressed against the gum. For a stomach complaint, a small infusion, though you did not drink too much unless you wanted to meet your ancestors immediately. The plant worked like a translator between breath and blood, and so it slid into magic without hardly moving. A healer might blow smoke on a patient's skin and then tap the pattern with a feather to make the pain feel noticed. If someone had a bad dream, A small cloud could be drawn like a curtain between the dream and the next night. There were even practical uses that sound like jokes, but were not. Mosquitoes do not like smoke, and sometimes neither do quarrels. Where smoke drifted, arguments tended to sit down and think about themselves. If you're not asleep yet, take that as a sign that you may be deeply interested in early modern pest control. Then a ship appeared on the horizon with sails like folded linen, and the plant found a new theater. Sailors met smoke first as a curiosity and then as a pastime. They learned quickly. One chronicler wrote that they drank the fumes, which shows you how difficult it was to find the correct verb at first. On deck, away from barrels of powder, they experimented with thin rolls and braids that could be tucked behind an ear during a storm. When the caravels nosed into European ports, they brought parrots, rumors, and tobacco. The parrots were noisy for a week and then quiet. The rumors dissolved. The tobacco stayed because it fit in a pocket and because it made waiting feel shorter. Apothecaries were given the plant and told to keep an open mind. They did. By the fire, scholars tried to classify its effects the way they classified eclipses and headaches, using Latin that curled at the edges like parchment left too close to the hearth. Courtiers, whose job was to notice trends before they became trends, noticed immediately. Pipes began to appear like exclamation marks in paintings that were otherwise about horses. But the spark traveled faster than legislation. Cities that had rules about everything, about how many buttons a jacket could have, and whether a window should look at a neighbor respectfully suddenly, faced the problem of smoke that moved through doors as if doors were a suggestion. Some leaders were charmed, others were alarmed. A few were both in the same week. One king was so disturbed by smoke that he wrote a very long letter explaining why he didn't like it, a letter that included almost as many adjectives as puffs. Another ruler enforced bans with bonfires supervised by officials who were secretly saving a little for later, because policy has never entirely erased curiosity. In some places, the plant was considered suspiciously enjoyable and therefore a threat to order. In others, it was welcomed as a fashionable form of breathing. Court physicians argued with court treasurers, which was the usual way of making a culture. Fines were posted. Then, when fines proved insufficient, entire barrels of contraband were burned in public squares that suddenly smelled less like law and more like an overcooked picnic. While edicts ignited and fizzled, merchants noticed a slow, reliable arithmetic forming on their ledgers. If you plant a field of tobacco, you can roll it into the size of a book and ship it across the world. A leaf could become a farm. A bale could become a town. You could grow it in places that liked sun and rain and alternating chapters. And so the plant linked maps together. It followed older trade paths, attached itself to new ones, and asked for labor that was heavy, repetitive, and often coerced. Empires learned to spell the word monopoly the way school children learned to spell their names. Licenses were sold. Duties were collected. A pipe filled in London could be balanced by a life bent in a field somewhere warmer. The price of smoke, which looks like nothing, turned out to be made of time. Row upon row of time. You can count it slowly, without judgment, and see how long a habit lasts when it has ships behind it. The silky roots of porcelain tea and the rough roots of human bondage braided themselves with the puffs of tobacco until the map looked like a knot someone could not finish undoing. If you doze during that sentence, that is fine. Knots are easiest to understand with your eyes half closed. And yet, even in the ledgers, the plant managed to stay a little bit theatrical. It made props. The 17th and 18th centuries were full of them pipes with stems long enough to hold in two hands like an instrument. Bowls shaped like acorns, mouthpieces inlaid with metal so that teeth would not worry them into crumbs. Snuff provided a new choreography of the nose. Tiny boxes were engineered with springs and hinges of such precision that the act of opening them felt like consulting a watch. A pinch between thumb and forefinger became a gesture that suggested you had read a book recently. Perfumed varieties were mixed with bergamot, violets, and the faint smell of the cedar drawer where the box slept at night. The pinches were small, but the sneezes were operatic. Snuff traveled in pockets into opera houses anyway, and into parliaments, where debates were punctuated by little mounds of brown that got gently brushed from a sleeve. Pipes made their own circles, taverns, clubs, steps outside doors, slow societies where nothing urgent happened on purpose. Then paper arrived as if it had been waiting in the wings the whole time. Cigarettes were a very tidy idea. Shred the leaf, roll it in patience, and add a spark. Factories found that patience could be mechanized. Nations found that soldiers liked something to do with their hands between orders. You can measure the 19th century in the number of matches a person carried in a week. From time to time, doctors stepped into this clouded stage like librarians who had wandered into a party. At first they were impressed by tobacco's energy. It seemed to sharpen attention, and for a moment, the medical journals and the advertisements almost agreed. Famous actors held a brand and smiled in a way that suggested the lines would be easier to remember now. White coats nodded. The word soothing did extra shifts. But in the back rooms of hospitals, in the patient notes written with the quiet handwriting of people who were too tired to embellish, statistics began to collect like ash in a tray that nobody had emptied. X-rays added their gray to the gray. The data grew like an unwatered plant slowly, stubbornly, in one direction. A few researchers drew graphs that were not suitable for billboards. When they spoke, they had the modest excitability of people who have counted to a number they do not like. Industry responded with filters, which were very convincing socks for smoke, and with phrases like low tar, which sounded as if you could order a safer bonfire. A new genre of denial was invented, with a vocabulary of reasonable doubt and a budget. Warnings soon became part of the design, printed in fonts that made them look like shy commandments. On one side of the pack, a color, a name, a mountain, perhaps a cowboy. On the other, a sentence about risk, standing there like the friend who tells you the time when you hadn't asked yet. Governments discovered that labels could speak, and so they made them speak louder. Bills were signed. Bans were posted where conversations happen on buses, in waiting rooms, in the sections of restaurants where lighting a match had once been an accepted way to count to 10. Vending machines were emptied. Lighter fluid lost a little of its swagger. Meanwhile, people kept finding new ways to make the air interesting. Vapes appeared with their small inventions of flavor that sounded like candy and astronomy at once. A grape nebula, a vanilla comet. The vocabulary changed, but the gesture remained. A hand raising something to a mouth, a cloud rendered politely. Even when the smoke was gone, its choreography stayed. You could see it in the way an empty hand still reached for a pocket when a conversation turned to the weather. Tobacco's cultural afterlife has its own quiet talents. It remembers stories better than people do. If you sift through old trays and ash urns, through the tins that used to carry blends with names that sound like retired detectives, you find fragments of entire rooms. The smell of a study where someone was always almost finishing a letter. The bench outside a station where journeys looked longer than they turned out to be. The doorways where strangers became not strangers because one of them had a light. There are snuff bottles carved so delicately that you can see the artist trying to keep their hands from trembling, which, if you think about it, is a small irony in a bottle. There are pipes in museums with scorch marks that look like commas, as though the wood had paused to say something. There are ashtrays shaped like seashells, suggesting that someone once believed smoke could be taught to listen for the tide. The plant itself has never been entirely impressed by our arguments. It keeps growing with an expression of botanical neutrality, large leaves that collect sunlight with no opinion, small pink flowers that open as if posing for a book of stamps, seeds as numerous as calendar days. It does not know that it was once taxed by the pound and by the dream. It does not know that a monarch swore it was unchristian, while a neighboring monarch tucked a little pouch into his sleeve for later. It simply waits for harvest, for drying sheds where time is calibrated in shade, for the soft crackle that means it is ready to crumble into a new shape. Farmers still hang leaves on rafters in rows that make barns feel like libraries of brown paper. In the morning, the smell is part bread, part hay, part something older. The air knows paragraphs you cannot see. One could try to reach a conclusion here, but conclusions have a habit of hurrying the listener, and tonight we have sworn not to hurry anything. It may be enough to observe that smoke has always been an editor of human time. It shortens pauses and lengthens evenings. It travels easily across borders where other cargo is searched more carefully. It keeps creating little societies that appear wherever there is a step, a stoop, a corner out of the wind. Even when we tell it to leave, it waits just around the corner, like a conversation we might decide to continue later. If you need a final fact to carry into sleep, in the 18th century, along the Thames, there were emergency kits for rescuing the drowned that included bellows designed to blow warm tobacco smoke where warmth might be useful. It was an idea that did not last, but the image is so politely absurd that it sits down beside you and requests a blanket. The forgotten parts are never truly gone. They are folded into objects that dust loves, boxes, tins, long-stemmed pipes asleep in drawers, packets of papers with a thin aroma of choices. Somewhere in a pocket, there is still a matchbook with a phone number whose owner has moved 3 times and changed names once. Somewhere there is a balcony with the faint geometry of a vanished habit traced in a lighter patch of paint. In museums, the labels use careful words like ritual, commerce, and public health, and they are perfectly right. But the glass also holds quieter statistics, the number of thumbs that learned the exact pressure it takes to tamp a bowl, the number of conversations that started because someone asked for a light, the number of evenings that belong to nobody in particular and therefore belong to everyone. If you look at the spiral again, the small gray ladder that climbs 1,000 years in place, you will see that it never really ends. It just thins. It makes room. It becomes a memory that understands how to leave space for sleep. You might not expect a single bend in a strand of wire to have a family tree, a quiet geography, and a way of whispering "not now" to flying papers, but it does. The paperclip looks like the kind of object that arrives in life fully formed, like dew. It lives in small desk drawers and politely avoids the spotlight. Yet it is older than most office jokes and more patient than most inboxes. Tonight we'll walk through its slow history the way a clerk strolls to the filing cabinet after lunch, unhurried, making sure not to drop the one memo that matters. If you are still awake when we get to the part about the clip, as ideal radius, you can subscribe, or you can put the thought on hold with a tiny wire loop and let it dangle there. Either way, I'll never know. Before the clip, there were pins, and the pins were trouble. They were lovely in a glinting, inconvenient way, like small daggers that were always in the wrong bit of the story. Early clerks used straight pins to hold papers together, which did keep the papers from escaping, but only by poking them in the text and then sometimes in the clerk. You can imagine the margins of 17th century ledgers perforated like lace. Little constellations of holes mapping where an extra sugar shipment had to be attached to the invoice that forgot about it. Wax seals tried to help. Ribbons did their elegant best. String was practical but had ambitions to become knots, and knots had ambitions to become legends. Red tape, which actually was red tape, sat on rolls and waited for a document to be judged important enough to be temporarily strangled. There were clever fasteners to flat brass things that looked like small centipedes of metal brads that spread their little arms under the page, as if to embrace the whole paragraph, and devices with names like bodkin, and file spine, which sound like minor characters who only appear in Chapter 3. Each method worked in a way, but each method asked the paper to be a little braver than paper naturally is. The material wants to lie there and be legible. It does not dream of being impaled and then folded for storage like a picnic gone wrong. The quiet ambition of office work has always been the same: to make order without injuring anything. That ambition was waiting for someone to look at a wire and think, what if the page just wore a ring for a while? The wire was ready. Industrial drawing mills could pull a rod through smaller and smaller holes until it forgot it had ever been heavy. Spools of this thin patience sat in factories beside machines that understood how to make repetition dignified. In 1867, a patent in the United States described using a wire bent to form a clasp meant to affix tickets to fabric without a pin practical. If you've ever tried to attach a price tag to something that doesn't want to be punctured out of principle. A few years later, another patent imagined a clip for papers with a curlicue so hopeful you could almost hear it humming. These inventions multiplied like weekday mornings, but the style that would sneak into every drawer had an unassuming name: gem. 2 loops, a reasonable oval, no sharp edges, and a way of holding papers by being calm near them. The gem was manufactured in Britain in the 1890s and given a trademark by an American firm that sold it with the pride of someone who knew a quiet idea when they saw one. It did not claim to attach with passion. It simply sat, applied a mild pressure, and suggested that the wind should be patient. Meanwhile, a Norwegian inventor patented a design with similar ambitions but slightly different bends, and later stories would insist he invented the entire concept, which was not exactly correct, and not exactly incorrect in the way that office myths often are. The truth, like a file folder, had tabs on more than one side. What matters is that the shape that one does not scratch, and that you can attach it with one hand while holding a cup of coffee in the other, which is the ultimate test of any administrative technology. The physics of the clip is gentler than it looks. It is a spring pretending not to be. The 2 inner surfaces apply pressure because wire remembers where it used to be, and the page is invited to live in the gap between memory and the present. If that sounds poetic, consider that the best office tools always are. The ideal wire for a gem is stiff enough to push back, soft enough to bend without throwing a tantrum, and smooth enough that it doesn't sand a whisper of paper into confetti. Factories make coils. The coils make a delicate clink when they are lifted, and the machines that bend them do so with the same little elbow of motion again and again until bins are full. There is a recommended number of loops to clip together, at once about 10, maybe 12 if the paper spent the weekend being meek. More than that, and you are asking the clip to do philosophy. There are variants, of course: the oval that thinks it is a triangle, the trombone shape with a flourish, the one with little teeth that looks confident until you try to remove it and find it has sworn an oath to your report. Binder clips arrived later like tuxedoed cousins, prepared to hold whole chapters, whether those chapters had consented or not. But the gem remained the everyday rhythm, the lowercase letter of fasteners, easy to misplace and therefore always near. Clips do not simply sit, they wait for errands. A clipped stack is a sentence in office grammar, the pause before a signature, or question asking itself in whispers. On desks, miniature snowdrifts of paper adopt their little metal shepherds and stop migrating toward the window. In archives, an ancient letter acquires a clip so that the librarian can pretend it isn't nervous. During rationing times, cards and coupons lined up behind their tiny guardians, as if entering the cinema politely. There were times when a clip meant urgency, an envelope with a note and a key, temporarily married. There were times when it meant tenderness photographs kept together, not because they belonged to the same year, but because they belonged to the same person. On the subway of the 20th century, you could watch someone fold a clip into a makeshift hook for a zipper that had lost its pull, and active repair that only needs a spare second and a willingness to believe that wire is versatile. In the drawer, the unused ones migrated into small chains and necklaces as if trying to be a different species. If you happened to drop one, it became a SIM card ejector before there were SIM cards to eject. At least 2 magicians taught a clip to vanish in a sleeve and then reappear fastened to a different audience member's card. A party trick that somehow captures the essence of paperwork. Things depart, and then they arrive in a new place with a note indicating that nothing has changed. By the time offices learned to whisper the phrase paperless, the clip had already done its millennium of patience and did not take the hint personally. User interface designers chose it as the universal icon for attachments, which is a kind of sainthood for a tool, to be used even when absent. The little image of a clip reminds an email that it has baggage, and the email sighs and admits that it has. Someone somewhere inevitably nicknamed Cartoon Assistant after it, and the assistant tried its best, offering suggestions with the eerie optimism of a colleague who has not been told the project has shifted. The clip became a metaphor without raising its voice. Meanwhile, in mechanical rooms, coils of wire continued to become tiny ovals in the way stars become constellations only when viewed from a particular desk. The design endured trials it had not asked for. Clips held together train schedules that were late, university forums that were earlier than anyone expected, and the slightly damp instruction booklet that came with a houseplant of mysterious temperament. They fastened apology notes to boxes of muffins. They said, "Stay with your people for a while. Dispersion can wait." There's a soft joke about the paperclip's ideal bend radius, which is simply to say that the metal prefers not to be kinked. If you bend the wire too sharply, it sulks and snaps. If you bend it too lazily, it yawns and fails its only duty. In between is the quiet mathematics of pliancy. Engineers know the numbers, but clerks know the feeling. When you slide the clip on and it settles with a small, satisfied friction, you have discovered the office equivalent of a good cord. The paper agrees to be held. The clip agrees to be patient. The desk agrees to witness the treaty. Every now and then, a manufacturer experiments with plastic in cheerful colors that promise to make paperwork festive. These are pleasant to behold, like highlighters at a parade, but they have a habit of losing their spring in hot weather and pretending that gravity is someone else's department. Metal keeps its oath in July. It also ages pleasingly. A clip that has lived in a drawer for a decade acquires a faint tarnish, as if it had been thinking in the dark. There are collectors, yes, collectors who organize clips by style in small trays. From early double oval types to extravagant twisted versions that briefly believe themselves to be jewelry. This is a hobby that requires very little space and a temperament aligned with rainfall. It is impossible to discuss the object without glancing, very gently, at one of its stranger stories. During a time when daily life felt pinned to a rough board, people in a northern country wore paper clips in their lapels as a small emblem of togetherness. It was a signal that could pass as a habit and therefore survive the day, which is what signals are for. The clip's quiet solidarity was a reminder that a simple loop can suggest a promise. No more drama than that is needed for bedtime. Later, someone built a very large clip as a sculpture, and tourists took photographs, which suggest that even the quietest tools acquire legends if given decades and an open sky. The sculpture's loop holds nothing, and in holding nothing, it holds the idea of holding, which is far more restful than it sounds. In the background of these scenes, staples have their own empire. The stapler is decisive, a final word in a metal sentence. It requires extraction if you change your mind. The clip is hopeful in a different register. It believes in the possibility of later, of a stack that can be reorganized without scarring. Some offices are stapler countries. Some are clip republics. Most are mixed governments with a coalition of binder clips negotiating the budget. The clip is the party of no permanent holes. Even the binder clip, for all its bravado, is fundamentally a clip trying on a cape. It loves a stack and releases it with a theatrical squeeze of the silver wings, as though expelling a captive novel. People keep binder clips after they retire and use them to hold open cookbooks at the page where the soup finally admits its ingredients. In this constellation, the gem is the smallest star and the most constant. There are small arts that prefer the clip. Bookbinders sometimes use pairs of them to keep thread from sulking while glue thinks. Archivists employ plastic-coated versions that won't bite the past. In workshops, a clip becomes a jig to hold two little things together for a moment that looks nothing like paperwork and everything like patience. Craft teachers give children paper clips for chain making, discovering the timeless truth that if you provide a pile of anything that has a loop, a chain will appear. One clip holds one clip holds one clip, and soon you have a garland for a small celebration beside the photocopier. Somewhere, someone is making a Christmas tree entirely out of green clips. Somewhere else, someone is making a bracelet that will last exactly one afternoon and feel like success. These are not typical uses, but the beauty of a generalist tool is that it always has a spare moment for a side hustle. At the far end of technology, the clip remains unbothered. It has not required a software update. It does not need charging. It cannot call you by accident. It travels easily in a pocket without changing the meaning of the pocket. When lost, it does not appear on any map of anxiety. When found, it is immediately useful in the simple way a chair is useful. In a century that likes to rename everything, the paperclip has managed to stay the paperclip, which might be its most impressive trick. Even its mischief is modest. Occasionally one leaps toward a desk magnet and joins a little choir. Occasionally one refuses to let go of a page as if defending its honor. Occasionally one has a bent arm and therefore a personality. People anthropomorphize them without meaning to. You see a clip with one loop stretched, and you think worked hard, the way you might look at a shoe and think long walk. Tools mirror us not because they try to, but because we cannot help noticing ourselves in anything that keeps us company this long. If you would like one last detail while your eyelids negotiate with gravity, consider that the clip solves a very specific problem in mechanics. It provides friction without glue, tension without injury, and security without ceremony. This is the opposite of drama. It is the bureaucracy of kindness, the admin of gentleness. Somewhere a report is being kept together not because it is urgent, but because it would rather not be scattered. The wind moves through an open window. The stack does not fly. The clip quietly proves, again, that the simplest machines make the softest promises and keep them. And if in the next minutes your thoughts slide under the calm pressure of sleep, the way a page slides under a loop of wire, you will be doing exactly what this small invention has always wanted the papers to do. Staying put for a while, letting time pass without fuss held in place by something barely there and completely enough. You might not expect a curl of smoke to remember more stories than a library, but it does, drifting with the patience of something that has already read the ending. Tobacco, long before it was a habit, was a ceremony with a schedule slower than dusk. In villages where every sound had a season, smoke had a job: to carry breath to somewhere kinder and bring it back improved. The first smokes were not taken alone, and certainly not next to a printer jam. They arrived with songs and rattles, with gourds and shells, and a sense that the air could become a messenger if you asked nicely. If you were still awake when we reached the part about the royal snuff spoon that doubled as a tiny mirror, you may subscribe, or simply let the thought drift away like ash that declines to cling. Either option is acceptable to history, which is nothing if not accommodating. Anthropologists, the unhurried librarians of the field, found that many peoples of the Americas treated smoke as a polite doorbell to other realms. Pipes were carved from stone soft enough to remember thumbs. Bowls shaped like birds and fish held embers the way a nest holds an egg. Smoke was blown to the east because dawn lives there, or to the four directions because balance deserves a map. A healer might take a puff and trace it over a wound as if sketching a new outline for the body to try on. The leaf itself was strong in scent, a peppery gentleness with a memory of sun. Mixed with willow bark or with something minty, it promised to calm a cough by giving it better company. The phrases people used were practical poetry, holy breath, sky food, cloud, medicine, tiny metaphors with good bedside manners. The tools had patience. There were long-stemmed pipes for council talk, where silence needed a companion, and small pipes for carrying on the trail like a pocket diary. Those strings hummed. Fires were coaxed with the slow authority of a grandparent, and the first wafts rose like a curtain that doesn't mind being late. Smoke curled into hair and beaded necklaces and the wooden walls of lodges until everything took on a faint, sweet seriousness. The air itself seemed to say, in that calm way air has, that attention is a kind of hospitality. A circle formed, and everyone had a turn. You do not inhale another person's thoughts ahead of schedule. If a story forgot its ending, the pipe remembered it, a modest archive with a coal for a bookmark. Medicine and magic, which were still on speaking terms, treated tobacco as a tool that could sit on either shelf. A small wad tucked against a toothache, a leaf burned to soften sleeplessness, smoke blown across a newborn to politely introduce it to breath. Dreams were asked to be less confusing. Storms were asked to be less loud. There were taboos too. Nobody smokes when the sky is in labor. Nobody smokes before the hunt decides whether it's in a good mood. Not rules with punishments, just a neighborly understanding with the weather. If a vision came, it came quietly, the way a bird lands near you and pretends it arrived for a different reason. Then ships arrived, the way ships do, with soft shrieking and a pocket full of misunderstandings. Sailors crouched near fires and watched the leaves smolder with a confidence that asked to be imitated. It is not that the old world had never seen leaves burn. It is just that nobody had thought to hold a breath in the middle and call it interesting. Soon pipes were traded for knives and bells, and then for more pipes, because the world loves a loop. The first barrels of cured leaf found their way into cramped holds, tucked among planks that smelled of cod and cider and rope, and began their patient voyage. A sailor tried a puff and felt unusual and wrote, in the way sailors write, "It warms a man with a heat not of fire." This is technically meteorology and also marketing. Courts met the new smoke with the peculiar blend of suspicion and enthusiasm that courts apply to anything they can wear but might talk about. Ambassadors offered pipes the way you offer olives, gravely as if no one has invented laughter. Nobles who liked to collect oddities added tobacco to cabinets that already held nautilus shells and convenient earthquakes in jars. Catherine de' Medici sniffed powdered leaf for her son's headaches, which is a very royal way to get through a meeting. The Spanish called the cigar a cigarro after a word that may have begun as mayan saikar, to smoke, the syllables a small canoe riding from one language to another. In England, fashionable men performed the curious new ritual of exhaling on purpose. A poet observed one and composed a line that was mostly a cough. The smoke was a novelty, then a fashion, and then a habit and a suit of clothes trying to look like a philosophy. Some kings did not approve. They wrote letters about nostrils and foolishness, and one wrote a book whose title was longer than a winter afternoon. Bonfires were staged to rid the realm of this perfumed leaf, which had the immediate effect of perfuming the realm. In Istanbul, a sultan banned pipes so thoroughly that men hid them in their beards, which gave a certain shape to the afternoon air that no decree could entirely erase. In Moscow, a tsar issued a warning that resembled a weather report, high chance of exile with scattered whippings. Meanwhile, other monarchs set aside their opinions and kept a box on the desk, just in case the morning needed improving. Tobacco, like a stray cat, learned to approach each door differently. The plant had companions on its voyage. It traveled alongside sugar and silver, with maps that made triangles out of the ocean as though geometry could comfort geography. On islands and coasts, plantations were carved into green like furrows in a book, neat but not innocent. Fields needed hands, and empires found them by theft. Tobacco, sturdy, expressive, easy to cure with a little kindness and a good barn, became a currency in leaf form. Ships carried bales whose smell could make a harbor dream of a porch, even when the harbor had never seen one. The leaf's value trained accountants to do difficult arithmetic and trained human hearts to set the wrong price on other human hearts. The smoke that curled from luxurious pipes and salons had a passport stamped in too many languages, and the ink did not always dry. On the roads of Eurasia, pipe forms proliferated. In Japan, the kisaru appeared, a delicate reed of metal and bamboo that made each pinch of tobacco a small tea ceremony for the lungs. In China, water pipes drew smoke through a burbling stage direction, elegant as a fish who has learned to whisper. In Europe, long clay tavern pipes extended like quiet questions. Their fragile stems broke so often that taverns kept spares as if they were umbrellas. Sailors carved scrimshaw patterns on bowls during dull weather, turning idle time into museum exhibits. The Silk Roads, now joined by sea lanes, learned an additional cargo. Bouquets of scent, vanilla cherry, something that imagined itself to be forest after rain, because people have always wanted smoke to smell less like smoke and more like a pleasant memory of a kitchen. The nose, brave organ, became fashionable. Snuff leaf, cured and ground to the dignity of dust, entered the nostrils of Europe with a flair that would be comic if it were not so sincere. There were snuff boxes inlaid with mother of pearl, with tiny portraits, with secret compartments where love letters lost their shyness. A duke carried a box that also carried a clock, so he could know it was exactly 3 minutes past 11 when he sneezed in a gold room. People tapped their boxes as punctuation. A witty remark was followed by a pinch, a dull remark by 2 pinches, and a hopeful pause. Physicians, asked for opinions, provided them with the certainty of people not yet acquainted with data. Snuff was recommended for headaches, melancholy, and the general condition of being alive in a century that had not invented weekends yet. Cigars drifted up from the Caribbean like the musical note of a low string. Poros from Havana, cigars from Cuba, cheroots from elsewhere, each with the geometry of ash that threatened to drop precisely when the conversation reached its thesis. The cigar was a companion for walking slowly and thinking you looked like you were walking slowly on purpose. Paper, which had been keeping letters together, volunteered for a new task, becoming the path the smoke would take. The cigarette started as a tidy roll-up, paving the way for a future in which machines could roll them by the tens of thousands while singing a very boring song in metal. A French officer in a war discovered that a paper tube was easier to share in a trench than a pipe, and the habit acquired a ration book. It is one of history's smaller ironies that the lightest-looking form of tobacco learned to travel the heaviest roads. By the late 19th century, global trade had made tobacco as ordinary as buttons. Factories filled with the friendly noise of repetitive craft. Workers flicked wrists, trimmed ends, stacked packs into pyramids with the authority of people who know gravity personally. Advertising discovered that a cloud could have a voice. Posters suggested that smoke improved your tennis. Calendars suggested improved your calendar. Movie stars held cigarettes in ways that looked like punctuation for thoughts too glamorous to finish. A cartoon camel walked across a map with an expression that implied he had opinions on blend ratios. Tiny paper cards slipped into packs, ostensibly to stiffen them, coincidentally depicting actresses and racehorses and eventually baseball players. A quiet universe of trivia riding in the pockets of men whose jackets smelled like 1,000 afternoons. Science, which collects questions the way beaches collect shells, watched the air and began counting. Doctors in white coats, haunted by curiosity, peered at charts that slowly gathered a weather pattern shaped like an answer. Radiographs whispered, pathology slides held their breath. In England, 2 researchers examined the ordinary habits of hospital porters and bus conductors and found an extraordinary map of risk threaded through the ordinary. This did not make posters vanish. It made them look like previous weather reports. The industry countered with denials as smooth as satin. Filters arrived with the soothing self-confidence of colanders, and some were even tipped with activated charcoal, which sounds responsible enough to merit a badge. Laboratories, patient as ever, kept counting. In 1964, an American report spoke calmly in a voice so dry it could have been a desert. And people listened the way you listen when the librarian stands and clears a throat. Warnings appeared on packs, meek at first, then bolder. Meanwhile, billboards continued their cheerful dream of open roads under bigger skies than any real sky can manage. The glamour faded the way evening fades, not all at once, but decisively. In some countries, ashtrays disappeared from tables with the discretion of waiters replacing a course. In others, cigarette breaks retreated to porches, then to sidewalks, then to circles painted on sidewalks. As if invisibly rehearsing a folk dance called policy, new forms arrived bearing clever names. Light, which turned out to be a mood rather than a measurement. Low tar, which meant a filter had learned a party trick. Menthol, a minty negotiation with the throat. Each promised difference. Physics and physiology, who have no time for adjectives, kept their appointments. Culture adjusted without quite letting go. Pipes became the mascots of quiet detectives who think slowly in easy chairs. Cigars retreated to celebratory corners where babies and promotions share the same kind of confetti. Snuff, never entirely gone, lingered in tins and jacket pockets like a pastime that refuses to admit it has retired. Smokeless tobacco found its own loyal geography, discreet as a secret handshake. And then, in the 21st century, vaping arrived riding on a gadget wave, offering clouds that smelled like strawberries that had learned geometry. New debates began, younger than ash, older than appetite. Some saw harm reduction. Some saw harm reheated. The air acquired a new vocabulary of coils and pods, and a familiar sense that technology has again volunteered to help human desire negotiate with human caution. Through all of it, one could map an empire of growing fields and shrinking liberties. Farmers tending plants with the quiet concentration of people who have solved the riddle of seasons. Workers in factories whose fingers knew leaf textures the way pianists know keys. Shopkeepers stacking packs by brand color the way a mason stacks bricks. And at the far end of the chain, people lighting, exhaling, considering, finishing, and then tapping ash into trays that remember 1,000 sentences. Public spaces change costumes. Trains forbid smoking with small pictograms of cigarettes crossed by lines so neat they almost look like compliments. Doors acquired outdoor ash bins like little owls with stainless steel eyes. Lungs everywhere resumed their hobby of moving air in and out without commentary, which is their preferred genre. What we call denial looked, in retrospect, like a pause that had been sitting there all along, disguised as a billboard. Doctors learned to speak in numbers a person can hear while stirring soup. They told stories of risk in gentle graphs. Meanwhile, in living rooms, grandparents who had once smoked on sofas told teenagers not to, then apologized to the wallpaper. Nicotine replacement therapies appeared with an air of helpfulness, like a sensible friend volunteer at a yard sale. Patches, gum, lozenges, small technologies that play the role of understudies until desire forgets its lines. The political arguments over bans and taxes and freedoms continued at their own speed, because nothing involving people and habits moves quickly for very long. There are ghosts in the air, but they are polite ghosts. They smell faintly of cedar and long car rides and concerts where you can still hear the bass line 2 streets away. You encounter them when you open a box of old letters and the past leans out to say hello. On a cold night, if you see your breath, you might think of the way people once watched the same white plume and told themselves it meant different things: prayer, medicine, fashion, fatigue, friendship, rebellion, consolation, something to do with the hands. Warnings on packs grew larger, then became pictures, then in some places became the pack itself, plain, demure, a quiet voice in a loud marketplace. The culture did not vanish. It decanted, settled, found smaller containers, a porch light at midnight, a back alley after a film, a corner table outside a cafe where words still require a prop and someone obliges. If this all sounds like a very long exhale, that is not accidental. Tobacco history is a timeline drawn in smoke visible, then gone, then faintly perfuming the curtains. A sacred leaf became a royal vice, became an industry, became a data set, became a warning label, and finally became a conversation you have with yourself while looking for a lighter you promised not to own. The story rarely accelerates. It drifts and we drift with it, past rituals with feathers and rattles, past court salons with gold snuff spoons, past factory floors where machines sing the same stanza until lunch, past laboratories where graphs creep upward like vines that have found a trellis. Somewhere there is still a pipe carved from soft stone, a bowl that fits a palm, so exactly that you can't tell whether the palm learned the bowl or the bowl learned the palm. Somewhere a field sighs when wind moves over leaves that evolve to listen. And now we arrive at the quiet part where the ash is cold and the cup is empty and the room is mostly air again. The forgotten histories, the small absurdities, the earnest opinions of noses and kings all settle like dust that refuses to be dramatic. If your eyelids are heavy, good. The smoke has done its best impression of a lullaby without involving any harmful chemistry. Think of the first smokes, holy breath rising like a ladder into a patient sky. Think of a courtier tapping a box as if to summon a thought worth tapping. Think of a warning on a pack doing the humble work of a gatekeeper who doesn't relish the job. The rest of the story will still be here when you wake, drifting in the library of the air, turning pages so slowly that even time forgets to interrupt. You might not expect a curl of smoke to remember more stories than a library, but it does, drifting with the patience of something that has already read the ending. Tobacco, long before it was a habit, was a ceremony with a schedule slower than dusk. In villages where every sound had a season, smoke had a job: to carry breath to somewhere kinder and bring it back improved. The first smokes were not taken alone, and certainly not next to a printer jam. They arrived with songs and rattles, with gourds and shells, and a sense that the air could become a messenger if you asked nicely. If you were still awake when we reached the part about the royal snuff spoon that doubled as a tiny mirror, you may subscribe or simply let the thought drift away like ash that declines to cling. Either option is acceptable to history, which is nothing if not accommodating. Anthropologists, the unhurried librarians of the field, found that many peoples of the Americas treated smoke as a polite doorbell to other realms. Pipes were carved from stone soft enough to remember thumbs. Bowls shaped like birds and fish held embers the way a nest holds an egg. Smoke was blown to the east because dawn lives there, or to the 4 directions because balance deserves a map. A healer might take a puff and trace it over a wound, as if sketching a new outline for the body to try on. The leaf itself was strong in scent, a peppery gentleness with a memory of sun. Mixed with willow bark, or with something minty, it promised to calm a cough by giving it better company. The phrases people used were practical poetry, holy breath, sky food, cloud medicine, tiny metaphors, with good bedside manners. The tools had patience. There were long-stemmed pipes for council talk, where silence needed a companion, and small pipes for carrying on the trail like a pocket diary. Those strings hummed, fires were coaxed with the slow authority of a grandparent, and the first wafts rose like a curtain that doesn't mind being late. Smoke curled into hair and beaded necklaces, and the wooden walls of lodges until everything took on a faint, sweet seriousness. The air itself seemed to say, in that calm way air has, that attention is a kind of hospitality. A circle formed, and everyone had a turn. You do not inhale another person's thoughts ahead of schedule. If a story forgot its ending, the pipe remembered it, a modest archive with a coal for a bookmark. Medicine and magic, which were still on speaking terms, treated tobacco as a tool that could sit on either shelf. A small wad tucked against a toothache, a leaf burned to soften sleeplessness, smoke blown across a newborn to politely introduce it to breath. Dreams were asked to be less confusing. Storms were asked to be less loud. There were taboos too. Nobody smokes when the sky is in labor. Nobody smokes before the hunt decides whether it's in a good mood. Not rules with punishments, just a neighborly understanding with the weather. If a vision came, it came quietly, the way a bird lands near you and pretends it arrived for a different reason. Then ships arrived, the way ships do, with soft creaking in a pocket full of misunderstandings. Sailors crouched near fires and watched the leaf smolder with a confidence that asked to be imitated. It is not that the old world had never seen leaves burn. It is just that nobody had thought to hold a breath in the middle and call it interesting. Soon pipes were traded for knives and bells, and then for more pipes because the world loves a loop. The first barrels of cured leaf found their way into cramped holds, tucked among planks that smelled of cod and cider and rope, and began their patient voyage. A sailor tried a puff and felt unusual and wrote, and the way sailors write, it warms a man with the heat, not of fire. This is technically meteorology and also marketing. Quartz met the new smoke with a peculiar blend of suspicion and enthusiasm that courts apply to anything they can. Teaware but might talk about. Ambassadors offered pipes the way you offer olives, gravely as if no one has invented laughter. Nobles who liked to collect oddities added tobacco to cabinets that already held nautilus shells and convenient earthquakes in jars. Catherine de' Medici sniffed powdered leaf for her son's headaches, which is a very royal way to get through a meeting. The Spanish called the cigar cigarro after a word that may have begun as mayansicar, to smoke, the syllables a small canoe riding from one language to another. In England, fashionable men performed the curious new ritual of exhaling on purpose. A poet observed one and composed a line that was mostly a cough. The smoke was a novelty, then a fashion, and then a habit and a suit of clothes trying to look like a philosophy. Some kings did not approve. They wrote letters about nostrils and foolishness, and one wrote a book whose title was longer than a winter afternoon. Bonfires were staged to rid the realm of this perfumed leaf, which had the immediate effect of perfuming the realm. In Istanbul, a sultan banned pipes so thoroughly that men hid them in their beards, which gave a certain shape to the afternoon air that no decree could entirely erase. In Moscow, a Tsar issued a warning that resembled a weather report, high chance of exile with scattered whippings. Meanwhile, other monarchs set aside their opinions and kept a box on the desk, just in case the morning needed improving. Tobacco, like a stray cat, learned to approach each door differently. The plant had companions on its voyage. It traveled alongside sugar and silver, with maps that made triangles out of the ocean as though geometry could comfort geography. On islands and coasts, plantations were carved into green like furrows in a book, neat but not innocent. Fields needed hands, and empires found them by theft. Tobacco, sturdy, expressive, easy to cure with a little kindness and a good barn, became a currency in leaf form. Ships carried bales whose smell could make a harbor dream of a porch, even when the harbor had never seen one. The leaf's value trained accountants to do difficult arithmetic, and trained human hearts to set the wrong price on other human hearts. The smoke that curled from luxurious pipes and salons had a passport stamped in too many languages, and the ink did not always dry. On the roads of Eurasia, pipe forms proliferated. In Japan, the kisaru appeared, a delicate reed of metal and bamboo that made each pinch of tobacco a small tea ceremony for the lungs. In China, water pipes drew smoke through a burbling stage direction, elegant as a fish was learned to whisper. In Europe, long clay tavern pipes extended like quiet questions. Their fragile stems broke so often that taverns kept spares as if they were umbrellas. Sailors carved scrimshaw patterns on bowls during dull weather, turning idle time into museum exhibits. The Silk Roads, now joined by sea lanes, learned an additional cargo, bouquets of scent vanilla cherry, something that imagined itself to be forest after rain, because people have always wanted smoke to smell less like smoke and more like a pleasant memory of a kitchen. The nose, brave organ, became fashionable. Snuff leaf cured and ground to the dignity of dust, entered the nostrils of Europe with a flair that would be comic if it were not so sincere. There were snuff boxes inlaid with mother of pearl, with tiny portraits, with secret compartments where love letters lost their shyness. A duke carried a box that also carried a clock, so he could know it was exactly 3 minutes past 11 when he sneezed in a gold room. People tapped their boxes as punctuation. A witty remark was followed by a pinch, a dull remark by 2 pinches, and a hopeful pause. Physicians asked for opinions, provided them with the certainty of people not yet acquainted with data. Snuff was recommended for headaches, melancholy, and the general condition of being alive in a century that had not invented weekends yet. Cigars drifted up from the Caribbean like the musical note of a low string. Puros from Havana, cigars from Cuba, cheroots from elsewhere, each with a geometry of ash that threatened to drop precisely when the conversation reached its thesis. The cigar was a companion for walking slowly and thinking you looked like you were walking slowly on purpose. Paper, which had been keeping letters together, volunteered for a new task, becoming the path the smoke would take. The cigarette started as a tidy roll-up, paving the way for a future in which machines could roll them by the tens of thousands while singing a very boring song in metal. A French officer in a war discovered that a paper tube was easier to share in a trench than a pipe, and the habit acquired a ration book. It is one of history's smaller ironies that the lightest-looking form of tobacco learned to travel the heaviest roads. By the late 19th century, global trade had made tobacco as ordinary as buttons. Factories filled with the friendly noise of repetitive craft. Workers flicked wrists, trimmed ends, stacked packs into pyramids with the authority of people who know gravity personally. Advertising discovered that a cloud could have a voice. Posters suggested that smoke improved your tennis. Calendars suggested it improved your calendar. Movie stars held cigarettes in ways that looked like punctuation for thoughts too glamorous to finish. A cartoon camel walked across a map with an expression that implied he had opinions on blend ratios. Tiny paper cards slipped into packs, ostensibly to stiffen them, coincidentally depicting actresses and racehorses and eventually baseball players. A quiet universe of trivia riding in the pockets of men whose jackets smelled like 1,000 afternoons. Science, which collects questions the way beaches collect shells, watched the air and began counting. Doctors in white coats, haunted by curiosity, peered at charts that slowly gathered a weather pattern shaped like an answer. Radiographs whispered, pathology slides held their breath. In England, 2 researchers examined the ordinary habits of hospital porters and bus conductors and found an extraordinary map of risk threaded through the ordinary. This did not make posters vanish. It made them look like previous weather reports. The industry countered with denials as smooth as satin. Filters arrived with the soothing self-confidence of colanders, and some were even tipped with activated charcoal, which sounds responsible enough to merit a badge. Laboratories, patient as ever, kept counting. In 1964, an American report spoke calmly in a voice so dry it could have been a desert, and people listened the way you listen when the librarian stands and clears a throat. Warnings appeared on packs, meek at first, then bolder. Meanwhile, billboards continued their cheerful dream of open roads under bigger skies than any real sky can manage. The glamour faded the way evening fades, not all at once, but decisively. In some countries, ashtrays disappeared from tables with the discretion of waiters replacing a course. In others, cigarette breaks retreated to porches, then to sidewalks, then to circles painted on sidewalks, as if invisibly rehearsing a folk dance called policy. New forms arrived bearing clever names: light, which turned out to be a mood rather than a measurement; low tar, which meant a filter had learned a party trick; menthol, a minty negotiation with the throat. Each promised difference. Physics and physiology, who have no time for adjectives, kept their appointments. Culture adjusted without quite letting go. Pipes became the mascots of quiet detectives who think slowly in easy chairs. Cigars retreated to celebratory corners where babies and promotions share the same kind of confetti. Snuff, never entirely gone, lingered in tins and jacket pockets like a pastime that refuses to admit is retired. Smokeless tobacco found its own loyal geography, discreet as a secret handshake. And then, in the 21st century, vaping arrived riding on a gadget wave, offering clouds that smelled like strawberries that had learned geometry. New debates began, younger than ash, older than appetite. Some saw harm reduction, some saw harm reheated. The air acquired a new vocabulary of coils and pods, and a familiar sense that technology has again volunteered to help human desire negotiate with human caution. Through all of it, one could map an empire of growing fields and shrinking liberties, farmers tending plants with the quiet concentration of people who have solved the riddle of seasons, workers in factories whose fingers knew leaf textures the way pianists know keys, shopkeepers stacking packs by brand color the way a mason stacks bricks. And at the far end of the chain, people lighting, exhaling, considering, finishing, and then tapping ash into trays that remember 1,000 sentences. Public spaces changed costumes. Trains forbid smoking with small pictograms of cigarettes crossed by lines so neat they almost look like compliments. Doors acquired outdoor ash bins like little owls with stainless steel eyes. Lungs everywhere resumed their hobby of moving air in and out without commentary, which is their preferred genre. What we call denial looked, in retrospect, like a pause that had been sitting there all along, disguised as a billboard. Doctors learned to speak in numbers a person can hear while stirring soup. They told stories of risk in gentle graphs. Meanwhile, in living rooms, grandparents who had once smoked on sofas told teenagers not to, then apologized to the wallpaper. Nicotine replacement therapies appeared with an air of helpfulness, like a sensible friend volunteer at a yard sale. Patches, gum, lozenges, small technologies that play the role of understudies until desire forgets its lines. The political arguments over bans and taxes and freedoms continued at their own speed, because nothing involving people and habits moves quickly for very long. There are ghosts in the air, but they are polite ghosts. They smell faintly of cedar and long car rides and concerts where you can still hear the bass line 2 streets away. You encounter them when you open a box of old letters and the past leans out to say hello. On a cold night, if you see your breath, you might think of the way people once watched the same white plume and told themselves it meant different things. Prayer, medicine, fashion, fatigue, friendship, rebellion, consolation, something to do with the hands. Warnings on packs grew larger, then became pictures, then in some places became the pack itself. Plain, demure, a quiet voice in a loud marketplace. The culture did not vanish. It decanted, settled, found smaller containers, a porch light at midnight, a back alley after a film, a corner table outside a cafe where words still require a prop and someone obliges. If this all sounds like a very long exhale, that is not accidental. Tobacco history is a timeline drawn in smoke visible, then gone, then faintly perfuming the curtains. A sacred leaf became a royal vice, became an industry, became a data set, became a warning label, and finally became a conversation you have with yourself while looking for a lighter you promised not to own. The story rarely accelerates. It drifts, and we drift with it, past rituals with feathers and rattles, past court salons with gold snuff spoons, past factory floors where machines sing the same stanza until lunch, past laboratories where graphs creep upward like vines that have found a trellis. Somewhere there is still a pipe carved from soft stone, a bowl that fits a palm so exactly that you can't tell whether the palm learned the bowl or the bowl learned the palm. Somewhere a field sighs when wind moves over leaves that evolve to listen. And now we arrive at the quiet part where the ash is cold and the cup is empty and the room is mostly air again. The forgotten histories, the small absurdities, the earnest opinions of noses and kings all settle like dust that refuses to be dramatic. If your eyelids are heavy, good. With smoke has done its best impression of a lullaby without involving any harmful chemistry. Think of the first smokes, holy breath rising like a ladder into a patient sky. Think of a courtier tapping a box as if to summon a thought worth tapping. Think of a warning on a pack doing the humble work of a gatekeeper who doesn't relish the job. The rest of the story will still be here when you wake, drifting in the library of the air, turning pages so slowly that even time forgets to interrupt. You might not think a plant could teach people how to breathe on purpose, but tobacco did in the unhurried way of things that arrive by smoke rather than by trumpet. Long before it became an item with a price in a pocket, the leaf was invited to ceremonies as if it were a guest with good manners. In lodges and plazas and river camps, a small fire was fed until it behaved, and then the smoke was guided like a letter addressed to the sky. Elders called it breath made visible. Healers coaxed it across foreheads, over aching knees, around infants not quite convinced about the project of being born. A pipe could be simple stone and stem, or it could be carved into animals that did not object to moonlight. Each form said almost the same thing. We have something to say, and we would like the air to carry it. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you may subscribe, or you may simply let me keep rambling while your pillow makes a persuasive counter-argument. I will not take attendance. The first smokes had schedules. Some were for councils where silence needed a partner. Some were for hunting because patience tastes better when the mouth has a task. Some were for healing, mixed with other leaves in proportions that elders remembered without measuring spoons. The etiquette was precise in a way that never felt strict. You did not puff while the wind was still choosing a direction. You did not exhale at a person, unless you intended a blessing, in which case you did it slowly, like lending a scarf. Smoke rose to the four directions because balance likes geometry. It slid into cedar beams and hair braids until everything carried a faint sweetness, the scent of wood that has read a lot of winter. There were taboos with the kindness of good. Neighbors, not during thunder. Not near newborns unless invited. Not when the dreams are working. A pipe passed around a circle, remembered the order even when the people forgot. The embers kept track of whose turn came next. Tobacco was also medicine with a pocket full of magic. A leaf softened and placed against a tooth eyed the pain as if to say, you have overstayed. Smoke chased mosquitoes with more authority than a hand could muster. Mixed with willow or mint, the leaf was persuaded to be gentle and to help a cough reconsider its plans. In some places, people blew smoke into water, and then the water, newly informed, was given to the sick. It all made a calm sense, breath, medicine, and story sharing the same small doorway. If a vision came, it did not shout. It arrived lightly, like a moth that has business with a lamp. The world smelled of campfire, not of fashion. No one yet owned ashtrays. The ash returned to Earth without any speeches. Then the ocean learned a new shape. Barrels and bundles and sailors who thought every new thing might be useful against boredom. On decks where rope and salt had already named everything tobacco, arrived with the kind of efficiency that only a leaf can manage. Men tried it, coughed, tried it again, and decided that the feeling was a sort of portable campfire, acceptable even when the weather was not. The smoke startled neighbors on shore. One Spanish villager, so the story goes, was imprisoned because his neighbors were concerned that his face produced clouds without any evident machinery. Curiosity sailed faster than wisdom. Leaves were packed tight with the grains and the oranges and the wishes of people who did not expect to be remembered. The first barrels that crossed carried a fragrance capable of persuading a dog to think of a porch. Ships moored at European ports, and tobacco stepped onto land as calmly as a cat already at home. Already in charge, courts met the smoke like they meet all novelties, with a dignified cough. Ambassadors were offered pipes as if they were oddly shaped forks. Alchemists sniffed and speculated. Catherine de' Medici pinched powdered leaf for royal headaches and concluded that the nose, as an invention, was even better than previously advertised. The words moved too, hurrying with a nervous gait from Maya and Taino tongues to Spanish, French, English, Arabic, each fitting the leaf into their grammar like a guess rune that would soon need expanding. Some rulers hated the whole operation. An English king wrote a splendid complaint comparing the habit to unpleasant weather. In the Ottoman world, a sultan banned smoking so thoroughly that men hid pipes in their beards, which gave the afternoon air a curious shape. A Russian Tsar ordered punishments so creative that ordinary fires looked merciful. And yet, elsewhere, other kings hoarded snuff in gilded boxes and pretended this was different. Bands and bonfires gave the leaf rehearsal time. Smoke learned how to move around a decree the way water learns the layout of stones. Meanwhile, far from palaces, fields changed their minds about what to grow. On coasts and islands, rectangles of earth were trained to produce leaf in dependable rhythms. Curing barns leaned against weather like quiet conspirators. In some colonies, tobacco became almost a money, more behaved than coins, easier than promises. Planters measured debts in pounds of leaf. Wages walked off the field in bundles that smelled like next week. The crop needed labor, and empires behaved badly. Trade routes drew triangles on maps as if geometry could distract from cruelty. The smell that drifted through European drawing rooms had already crossed a ledger where numbers did not behave like people, and people were forced to behave like numbers. Every time a pipe glowed on a winter street, a distant field had a difficult appointment. Forms multiplied as if they were a catalog determined to be exhaustive. In the Low Countries, long clay pipes balanced like pale fishing poles, wonderfully breakable, which is why taverns kept racks of replacements, the way umbrellas appear wherever rain is respected. In Central Europe, pipe bowls of meerschaum seafoam stone, light as an elderly seashell brown delicately with use, like bread commenced to blush. In China, water pipes introduced a burbling stage direction to the act. In Japan, the kisaru made each pinch of tobacco an essay, brief and meticulously edited. The Silk Roads, now supplemented by sea lanes, learned the new scent and added it to their established menu of silk, porcelain, and opinions. Each pipe was also a clock. Time moved at the rate of a smolder measured in tampings and tiny taps. Against the heel of a palm in the small, satisfied sounds of embers resettling. Snuff arrived like a rumor and then stayed like furniture. Powdered leaf was carried in boxes so elaborate, they occasionally forgot their original job. There were boxes with secret compartments so that a person could store both a pinch and a plot twist. There were Scottish moles in the shape of rams. Heads, their silver horns daring the sneeze to be dignified. A pinch had etiquette, never with the left hand, never while making an argument you weren't prepared to defend, always with a small flourish that suggested wit, even when none was available. Gentlemen tapped their boxes to punctuate conversation. Ladies adopted tiny spoons that doubled, conveniently, as mirrors, because grooming and habit are forever attending the same party. People wrote poems in which the rhyme scheme devolved into sneezes, which critics described as innovative. One pope banned snuff in church while keeping his own supply for migraines, a policy position familiar to many eras. From the Caribbean came cigars stitched from whole leaves, each a quiet baton that conducted unhurried happiness. In salons and verandas, ash accumulated like modest snowfall, threatening at every moment to collapse in a single dignified avalanche. Paper joined the performance. The cigarette began as a hand-rolled convenience, a portable compromise an army discovered in the Crimean War and then mislaid everywhere, including at home. Machines learned how to roll thousands an hour, humming their proud, boring song, and the world discovered that convenience is the most persuasive flavor. Match factories joined the chorus. Sulfur wrote its swift signature in every doorway. The 20th century learned to hold smoke the way a sentence holds a comma. Advertising improved smoke's opinion of itself. Posters announced that tobacco soothed throats, digested meals, dignified tennis, and, if necessary, broadened the shoulders. Caricatures taught camels to walk with self-esteem. Cowboys on billboards performed the dangerous act of being unhurried. Small cards slipped into packs to keep their shape and accidentally cultivated collectors, actresses, monarchs, locomotives, teams with stripes. Everyone learned a new choreography: tap the pack, knock the filter, share a light, borrow a light, promise to return the lighter, forget. The ashtray became a household planet around which conversation orbited at a safe distance. And then the other story, patient as moss, assembled itself in labs. Doctors counted. Statisticians compared bus drivers to conductors, dock workers to clerks, hospital porters to accountants, and found patterns as unavoidable as Tuesday. Pathologists pointed at slides the color of difficult weather and said quietly that the map was not friendly. Industry experts countered with words that sounded like velvet, doubt, controversy, further study, a vocabulary capable of making a door look like a hallway. Filters grew longer, tips wider, adjectives gentler. Menthol promised. A brisk walk in a leaf green afternoon. A brand or two hinted at athletes' lungs cheered by science. Yet the numbers continued to arrange themselves into charts that did not applaud. One winter morning, a national report spoke with the voice of a librarian, calm, clear, unimpressed by drama. Warnings appeared on packs, shy at first, then less so. Governments negotiated with ashtrays. Restaurants learned to sort air into sections, then discovered air's reluctance to respect upholstery. Trains mounted small pictograms of cigarettes, crossed by perfect diagonal lines, a gesture as tidy as a haircut. Some countries made the packs plain, which turned out to be a surprisingly loud shade of quiet. Advertising went on vacation. Meanwhile, in almost every family, a conversation unfolded that sounded like, "Please don't, I won't, I did." No one won the argument. Some people survived it. The culture did not disappear. It changed outfits. Pipes retreated to armchairs and detective novels. Cigars occupied special occasion corners beside bassinets and improbable trophies. Snuff, stubborn and aristocratic, continued to winter in obscure pockets. Smokeless tobacco maintained its small cartography across ballparks and farms. New devices entered with the optimism of gadgets. Vapes promised clouds that smelled like Fruits that had been to engineering school, the debates refreshed themselves. Harm reduced, harm relocated, harm rephrased. Coils warmed, batteries were charged with an intensity usually reserved for holidays. The whole enterprise repeated at newer angles the old discussion about breath and want and ritual, and the way a habit can be mistaken for a friend. If you look back across the centuries, past council fires and curt royal letters, past plantation ledgers and poster boys in hats too wide, past laboratories where ash statistics sit in beakers like reluctant tea, you see smoke performing the same curious trick. It makes time visible and then asks it to drift. A puff from a lodge carries a prayer. A puff from a boulevard carries a pause. Both are little boats. The leaf that was once a healer became a business that became a crisis that became a quieter business still. Tobacco never hurried. Even its scandals took their time. The world, gradually and then suddenly, relearned how to breathe nothing at all and discovered the expensive luxury of unscented rooms. But the ghosts in the air remain, soft as sweater lint, open as shoebox of old letters and hello, the memory of grandparents at a kitchen table, a concert in a late century where everyone pretended the fog machine was enthusiastic, a train platform, under a roof that turned language into glistening arcs. Warnings continue their plain speech. Packs shrug in their drab uniforms. A person on a porch lifts a cigarette as if to underline a sentence that didn't need it. Somewhere a pipe carved from meerschaum darkens one shade closer to conversation. Somewhere else a field of tobacco plants lifts its broad leaves to the sun with the slow confidence of plants generous with shade. The story has the manners to end without ending. If your eyes are heavier than ash, that is fine. History will keep smoldering, not because it must, but because it has always been good. At waiting for the next breath, you might not expect a leaf to teach people how to breathe, but tobacco did in a very patient way, as if the plant had all evening and the evening after that. Long before shops had counters and counters had glass, the first smokes belonged to rooms that had no clocks. People warmed stones, coaxed a coal to behave, and set herbs to smolder until the air turned into a gentle announcement. The smoke went where fingers pointed toward the four directions. Over a sleeping child through the doorway like a polite guest. Pipes were not yet accessories. They were small boats for wishes. A bowl cut from stone carried a private weather. System. A reed stem learned the route between one mouth and another and remembered the order better than the people did. If you stay awake long enough for me to reach the part about powdered leaves and gold boxes, feel free to subscribe or don't. I'll be here either way, moving as slowly as ash, deciding where to fall. Ceremonies had schedules as soft as felt. A healer would lift the pipe when the wind agreed to stop being complicated. Words were invited to sit down, to cool off, to enter. The smoke unlearned calm grammar. Hunters borrowed a little courage from a puff that knew how to wait. Grandmothers pressed leaf against a sore tooth and said, "Try this," because plants often listen to grandmothers. The mix changed with the hour. One pinch of sage persuading the tobacco to behave. Another of mint teaching it to be kind to throats that had argued too much. People blew smoke into water, and then the water, newly educated, was offered to fevers that didn't believe in bedtime. Magic, if that is what you want to call it, did not throw sparks. It moved like a quiet neighbor with helpful tools. Dreams reported that they had been escorted through an open door and returned gently before breakfast. No marketing department claimed responsibility. What the leaf did not do was hurry. It arrived in the morning lodge like a modest messenger and left by night as a faint sweetness in braids, blankets, and cedar beams. A pipe was a hinge between people and weather. The bowl burned, then rested, then burned again, as if rehearsing. The idea of patience until it could be performed without thinking. There were taboos with an air of kindness. Not during thunder, because thunder does not like competition. Not at a newborn's head, unless asked by a person who knows how to ask. Not while dreams are still building their scaffolds. Smoke as medicine, smoke as blessing, smoke as conversation that takes both sides seriously. This is the beginning of the story, and it is more restful than most beginnings. Then the ocean volunteered. Caravels made of tidy woodlines learned. A new cargo, Leaf competing politely with pigs, barrels, and wishes. On the long crossings, sailors tried to smoke because voyages have hours that need something to do. They coughed, they tried again, and they decided the feeling was a portable campfire that behaved oddly like companionship. When the first plumes curled above European docks, neighbors stared the way neighbors always stare at the beginning of anything. The idea traveled faster than it should have and exactly as fast as it was always going to. It found courtyards and kitchens. It climbed palace stairs without making excuses. It persuaded winter that it could be warmed from the inside. Out, at least for a minute or two, courts handled the novelty with great dignity and frequent sneezing. Ladies and gentlemen, who were already making a hobby out of being observed one another holding pipes and declared themselves improved. The leaf found its way into powders, which found their way into noses, which found their way into stories. A queen took snuff for headaches and announced that the nose, long underrated, could now be a sort of pharmacy counter. Alchemists sniffed and made notes about elements and ethers and the curious geometry of invisible things. A physician praised the leaf's vigor with such enthusiasm that the leaf blushed in a metaphorical way. Meanwhile, other rulers announced bans with the theatricality of a curtain drop. A sultan declared smoking an offense to order. Men had pipes and beards became suspicious as furniture. A tsar threatened imaginative punishments and then followed through because tsars were like that. Bonfires ate confiscated pipes, which made a dignified sizzling sound, and then everyone went home to cough privately. The bans never stayed, but they stretched the story. Tobacco slipped around to crease the way water finds the joints in a wall. When a city tried to outlaw smoke, a courtyard invented a new definition of indoors. When a town demanded fines, a tavern invented a very small cutting of the leaf that technically complied while clearly not intending to. The plant behaved like geography. It carved paths by insisting politely that it already had friends waiting. Fields changed their minds about what to grow. Along coasts and in river valleys, rectangles of land became regular the way woven cloth is regular. Sticks held up leaves like large green hands, and curing barns learned the scent that would later belong to warm attics and responsible cellars. In one place, debt and pay both arrived in rolled bundles. People measured obligations by weight and fragrance. Triangles appeared on maps, not because the world is a shape, but because merchants enjoy straight lines. Those lines, of course, ran through lives. Ships carried bondage along with barrels. Plantation bells trained days to break into fragments. The smoke that comforted parlors in far-off cities had traveled through a ledger where numbers forgot their manners, and where people were asked to be numbers. The leaf did not file complaints. People did in the ways they could. This is the quiet paragraph in many histories, and it is important to read even when you are sleepy. You can see the global habit forming pinch by pinch. In the Low Countries, taverns kept racks of long clay pipes as fragile as promises, so breakable that some places set out spares the way umbrellas appear where rain is realistic. In Central Europe, bowls of Meerschaum sea foamstone that must have wandered inland by way of a metaphor darkened with each use, like bread learning to be toast. In China, water pipes added a soft burble to the act, as if the breath itself had decided to sing a bass note. In Japan, the kisaru made the experience an essay, brief and elegant, one pinch serving as a paragraph that knew when to stop. Each device was also a clock. Time moved at the rate of ember and tamping, the universal tempo of waiting for something not necessary to finish being pleasant. Snuff arrived like a rumor and stayed like furniture. Powdered tobacco rode in small gilded boxes that became so proud of their hinges they sometimes forgot their contents. Gentlemen tapped lids to punctuate jokes, which improved the jokes at least by rhythm. Ladies used tiny spoons that doubled as mirrors because habit and vanity attend the same salon. A ram's head mole sat on a Scottish sideboard as if it were expecting guests and was disappointed to see only Tuesday. Etiquette adorned the sneeze with ceremony. Left hand frowned upon, right hand recommended, a brace of handkerchiefs close. At hand like polite cousins. One bishop scolded parishioners for sniffing during sermons and later excused himself to freshen his thinking. Micro-histories of noses filled pages that no one reads now, but you can almost hear the powder settling. Cigars. Were the leaves long sentences? Grown on islands where wind and soil consorted with sunlight in a way that encouraged confidence. Wrapped in whole leaves that remembered the field, they suggested leisure even when urgency hovered by the door. They appeared at births and negotiations, at card tables and verandas, at the exact moment when people wished to signal that time had been invited to sit. Ash fell in tidy cones that threatened collapse, the precarious architecture of good manners. The cigarette, when it joined, seemed modest paper and shred, a thin idea. Soldiers in one war shared them the way people share news. Factories in one century learned to roll them by the thousand, and then by the thousands, humming machinery songs that sounded like certainty. Convenience won, as convenience often does. Matches learned to strike with showy friction. Everyone knew. The dance, tap the pack, borrow a light, promise to return the lighter, forget. Posters thanked tobacco for everything and asked for nothing. A cowboy stared from a billboard and taught the sky to be bigger. A camel sauntered with the self-esteem of graphic design. Doctors in white coats shook hands with brands in dark suits, and both declared an alliance on behalf of harsh throats that wanted to believe in velvet. Collectible cards fell out of packs like polite confetti actresses, locomotives, national flags, baseball stars who squinted because stadium lights were not yet ambitions. Advertising aged into memory the way wallpaper fades where the sun reaches. You can still see it if you squint out. Meanwhile, people who counted for a living counted. They made lists of bus drivers and conductors, dock workers and accountants, pipe owners and people who preferred boredom. They arranged little squares of tissue on glass and peered at cells that had lost their manners. The numbers introduced themselves, shy at first, then certain. Charts with unromantic slopes appeared like bad weather that had learned arithmetic. Industry chose a patient vocabulary controversy, uncertainty, further study. Filters lengthened. Tips whitened. Menthol offered the sensation of walking briskly in a pine forest that was, regrettably, indoors. The machine that measures tar was asked to look again, as if politeness could rescue arithmetic. Yet the numbers were unimpressed by optimism, and they stayed where they were, which is the main thing numbers do. One winter morning, a report with the tone of a librarian spoke aloud. Warnings began to appear on packs, modest at first, the typographical equivalent of clearing a throat. Restaurants divided air with signage and hope. Trains posted small pictograms of cigarettes crossed by diagonal lines so crisp they almost whistled. Some countries introduced packaging so plain it somehow became aggressive. Billboards retired to warehouses and later to museum galleries where they looked surprised to be art. Courtrooms developed an expertise in the subject of air. The argument grew domestic. Kitchen tables heard everything. I'm quitting. I quit. I did not quit. I'll try again on Monday. I am accepting bribes in the form of cookies. Nicotine learned the architecture of patches and gum. People sat on back steps, thinking private thoughts that disappeared the way smoke had always promised everything would. The culture adjusted without ever quite letting go. Pipes retreated into armchairs and detective novels, inhaled slowly by people who liked their thoughts to last. Cigars kept to low-lit rooms where stories can brag, and no one is required to prove anything. Snuff persisted in clubs where leather chairs and thick carpets conspire to make time slower than it has to be. Chewing and dipping marked their territories in ballparks and barns, ruled by their own small etiquette and a tin that refuses to be anywhere except back pockets. And then the gadgets arrived, late but luminous. A coil warmed. A battery confirmed. The cartridge clicked with a tiny confidence. Vapor offered clouds that smelled not only of mint, but of fruits that had studied chemistry. Dragon fruit that had never seen a dragon. Mango with extra vowels. A vanilla that suspected itself of being a verb. The debates refreshed themselves like a desktop after a restart. Harm reduced, harm displaced, harm compared to the worst possible harm. The page looked different. The questions did not. Doctors continued to count, as calmly as weather. Countries. Raise taxes, then higher, as if they were trimming a hedge that insists on being enthusiastic. Some places banned smoking on beaches, which confused the gulls but pleased the towels. Airports built glass rooms where smoke could behave like an exhibit behind its own fogged glass. Bars learned the art of the sidewalk heater. Friendships moved 3 feet to the left. Coats learned new scents and shrugged. The ashtray, once a household planet with its own moons and rings, became a souvenir. Antique shops sell them now, heavy as memory, with logos from hotels that no longer exist and cruise lines that never could. Wordings on packs grew direct. A sentence speaking in the second person, in a font that doesn't joke, informed the holder about future negotiations with lungs and hearts and days not yet purchased. Photographs appeared that are not charming. People bought sleeves to hide them, which is a tiny form of denial and also an excellent example of human craft. Campaigns ran on television where ex-smokers spoke with voices that sounded like honesty does when it is tired. In some nations, smoking rates drop the way curtains drop at the end of a matinee. In others, the habit's geography rearranged itself like furniture being moved while half the family naps. The leaf never vanished. It reassigned its hours, ghosts. Remain in the air. Open a shoebox from the attic and you will know what year your grandfather liked to sit by the window. Borrow a book from a small-town library and a faint ribbon of scent will tell you that a previous reader made their way through the last chapter one puff at a time. Enter a jazz club at the end of a long week and notice that the atmosphere still remembers past decades, even when the law does not. Step onto a balcony in some city where neon scrawls its late homework across the sky, and you'll see someone holding a cigarette like a comma at the end of a sentence that could have ended, but decided to pause. It is less celebration than punctuation. The plant that began as breath made visible became a business, became an argument, became a grudging compromise with clean air, and is now a collection of smaller habits with better manners. In the beginning, a healer blew smoke into water and asked it to be wise. Later, a factory packed 20 paper dreams into a box that fit a shirt pocket. Later still, a battery learned to whisper. And through it all, human beings practiced exhaling on purpose, as if they were writing letters to weather. If you are still with me, and if you are not, this is also fine. Notice how the story never runs, not even when it thinks it should. It lingers at thresholds. It waits for the wind to settle. It teaches patience, occasionally by accident. Somewhere, A meerschaum pipe grows a shade darker, one more afternoon earned. Somewhere else, a field of tobacco lifts broad leaves like umbrellas politely opened for the sun. The thread is thin enough to sleep on. It stretches from lodge to lab bench, from snuff box to plain pack, from ashtray to empty bedside table. It does not end, it thins. And in that thinning, the room grows quieter, and the breath, your breath, learns again how to arrive and how to leave, softly as if it had all evening and the evening after that. You might not expect a plant to give lessons in breathing, but tobacco did, for centuries, with the patience of a kettle that never quite boils. In places where the roof beams learned the language of smoke, the first smolders were not habits, so much as ceremonies that behaved like weather. A healer would warm a coal with the practiced boredom of someone who knows the coal will come around eventually, and leaves crumbled, coaxed, sometimes mixed with other polite botanicals, would accept the heat as if agreeing to a conversation. The smoke did not rush. It rose with the manners of a guest who wipes their feet without being asked, then wandered toward the four directions to say hello, because the four directions, like elderly relatives, appreciate acknowledgement. People called it holy breath, not because it fixed everything, but because it made time walk instead of jog. If you find yourself still awake by the time I reach the king who tried to outlaw the smell of smoke on beards, feel free to subscribe, but truly don't strain. I'm going to keep talking whether your eyelids are open or simply considering. The evidence against being open, pipes were more like keys than tools. A small stone bowl held a local weather system, and the stem read, wood. Bone learned the path from hand to hand, from caretaker to guest, from elder to the person who forgot to sit near the door. A pinch of leaf for the living, a whisper for those who had already mastered quiet, and a little for the spirits who, being spirits, did not take up much space. Hunters breathed into the pipe and asked the animals' patience. Midwives waved smoke over blankets and asked for warmth that arrived on time. Names were given in rooms where the smoke taught everyone to speak with their inside voice. In some lodges, the tobacco was tempered with sage and sweetgrass. In others, with willow bark or mint. The recipes had the careful chaos of family soups. What the leaf treated depended on who you asked. Sore joints, stubborn grief, nightmares that didn't. Respect the schedule. Shamans blew smoke into water so the water would forget how to be nervous. Dreams, when they returned in the morning, carried the faint smell of cedar, which is the scent a dream wears when it wants to be taken seriously. Magic is a dramatic word for a series of small courtesies. Tobacco kept company with songs that did not rhyme because the point wasn't rhyme. It was remembering the steps. Tubbas were practical and tender. Not during a storm. Thunder doesn't like competition. Not over a cradle unless an elder asked the leaf to behave. Not when speaking rudely about someone who couldn't defend themselves. Smoke dislikes gossip because it is by nature democratic. Bowls were carved with faces so that someone would always be watching the ember. Feasts ended with a puff passed clockwise because the sun prefers consistency. People told the smoke where they had been and where they might go next, and the smoke being used to departures understood better than most. If you imagine the room, make it dim but kind, with light through the doorway like spilled milk. Imagine the coal glowing as a small red vowel, the one that lingers at the end of a word. Imagine a pause so warm it forgets to end dot, then an ocean decided to involve itself, which oceans often do. Caravels with patient ribs carried leaf in bales that smelled like someone had woven sunlight and thrift together. Sailors tried it on long. Watches because the horizon has a habit of repeating itself. A pull from a pipe turned the deck into a polite idea of a campsite. By the time the ship slouched into European harbors, the smoke knew how to make an entrance without appearing to. Try. It curled above docks and followed courtiers indoors, where servants fanned at it as if it were a cat that had wandered onto the wrong chair. Apothecaries sold it in paper twists with a confidence no one had formally approved. Physicians recommended it for everything that might plausibly benefit from a moment of breathing slowly. One scholastic declared it good for the memory. He wrote this down, then forgot where he put the paper, which is exactly the joke you think it is. Royal households did not resist the performance. Snuff boxes winked from pockets like very small planets, complete with weather, the drift of fragrant dust and moons, the tiny spoon and the tinier mirror. A nobleman took a pinch, sneezed into a handkerchief embroidered with a fraction of his income, then said, "Splendid." A queen held the pipe as if it were something between a scepter and a pet. Court painters added a little ghost of smoke to portraits, which made power look strangely domestic. And then, of course, the bans. Authorities cannot resist banning things that fly, because flying implies disobedience. A sultan threatened to cut off noses to address the problem at the source. The court historian, a man of tact, wrote, "This measure proved unpopular. A pope frowned, then unfrowned, then frowned again after a different advisor explained a different theory of salvation. A city posted fines and lit bonfires of confiscated pipes, sad little pyres with the scent of cedar cupboards, and went home satisfied that order had been restored. At least until tomorrow. Every band taught the smoke geography. Taverns widened their definition of indoors. Courtyards reinterpreted the wind. A tailor invented pocket-sized pipes and called them traveling companions, which they were. People smoked in the laundry room so the steam would show solidarity. In winter, windows learned to open 2 fingers wide, the architectural equivalent of an inside joke. Monarchs who outlawed tobacco also hoarded it as medicine, which is the kind of royal logic that keeps archivists amused. Some were a palace. Physician labeled a jar. For melancholy, evening use, avoid drafts. Somewhere else a policeman confiscated a pipe and later returned it because his wife liked the smell. Fields responded as fields do, by reorganizing their intentions. Land that used to grow everything now grew one thing in very disciplined rows. Curing barns learned to hum. Leaves hung in long galleries like green laundry, then turned the color of late afternoon. In some colonies, the leaf's economy braided itself into other economies with a knot only accountants could admire. Labor, forced and borrowed, carried bales whose weight seemed to increase whenever the foreman looked away. Triangles appeared on maps, ports, commodities. People moved against reason while books balanced themselves with lines and columns that looked, from a distance, like fences. The plant did not ask for any of this. Plants rarely do. But people did, which is why the history of a leaf can resemble the history of a ledger that has learned how to sigh. Meanwhile, the instruments multiplied. Clay pipes in public houses stood in racks like polite umbrellas, so fragile that landlords kept spares for the inevitable tragedies. Meerschaum bowls inlaid with silver were smoked with a sort of care, usually reserved for heirloom butter dishes. Water pipes burbled as if the smoke were learning to swim. In Japan, the kisaru turned the act into punctuation. One pinch, one brief cloud, the leaf taken seriously, and then dismissed with the flick of a metal tip. In the Andes, coiled leaves were tucked into cheeks for the slow arithmetic of a long day. In West Africa, the calabash pipe a gourd with the personality of furniture-counted evenings in rings of ash. Each device quietly taught a schedule. Embers are clocks. Tampers are paperweights for passing thoughts. An ash which looks like nothing is the neatest record keeper of all. Snuff became a social skill, which is to say it became ridiculous in precise and expensive ways. Boxes were carved from tortoiseshell that had spent its previous life minding its own business. Malls shaped like rams' heads guarded sideboards, with the patient menace of taxidermy. Etiquette manuals advise which hand to sneeze into and which handkerchief to prefer when one's dignity attempted to escape. Persian perfumers competed to name mixtures with adjectives that wandered off, without supervision. In Scotland, a whole club held a minute of silence for a gentleman who had unfortunately inhaled too enthusiastically. The secretary recorded with admirable restraint that the vote of condolence was unanimous and prompt. Cigars followed, courteous as guests who never forget the biscuits. They were long sentences rolled from whole leaves and men in linen suits. Attach them to long afternoons the way museum labels attach names to paintings. On island verandas, ash grew in improbable towers that fell at a whisper. Cigarettes arrived as paper dreams, cheap, fast, equal opportunity. Factories learned to roll them by the thousand while posters voted for glamour. A camel ambled across a billboard with the swagger of typography. A cowboy taught the sunset how to pose. For a while, doctors in white coats performed a handshake. With advertisements in black ink, the medical equivalent of a wink. Sports cards fell out of packs so that baseball could hitch a ride to the breakfast table. Children learned flags from tobacco cartons because the world is often practical in the oddest directions. Then laboratories sharpened their pencils. Lists were made. People who coughed were counted. People who had never smoked were counted. People whose jobs required spending all day inside a blue fog were counted twice because the fog had that sort of personality. Glass slides held cells, like difficult students. The graphs began as hesitations and became a choir, each line a note insisting on being heard. Industry supplied counterchoirs. Filters promised to be saints. Menthol promised to be oceans. The numbers, unimpressed, continued being numbers. A committee drafted a sentence that said in a modest font, "May be hazardous," which is bureaucratic for we're trying not to startle you. Another committee made the font larger. A third posted the letters on a black panel so that the words looked like a chalkboard that could not possibly be erased. Warnings leaned toward bravery. PACs began to audition for honesty. Restaurants redrew their floor plans, assuming air could be convinced to respect masking tape. Planes introduced the button that turned off the light that said no smoking, then later introduced a new plane that simply had the light forever on, which is either progress or defeat, depending on your patience for nouns. Some cities declared smoke-free everything, including parks that already had wind. In retaliation, culture invented the sidewalk heater and the balcony conversation. People stepped outside to consider life in weather that did not always agree. Newsagents sold lighters that became, briefly, souvenirs of trying, and the habit learned new electricity. Batteries the size of a polite pen warmed small coils like winter learning to knit. Clouds tasted like desserts that had studied chemistry. Dragon fruit that was surely born in a lab with excellent lighting. Custards that believed in themselves. Mints that sounded like verbs. Arguments refreshed themselves. Harm reduced. Harm relocated. Harm compared to ago. The leaf now sometimes skipped the leaf entirely and appeared as a number in a bottle. Someone somewhere claimed victory. Someone somewhere else kept a skeptical spreadsheet. Families, which always host the best debates, negotiated again. Promises were made in kitchens where timers dinged. Monday was appointed, then quickly reappointed, then finally promoted to a kind of holiday called This Time for Sure, yet ghosts linger in the fabric of old coats. Open a suitcase that belonged to your grandfather, and the lining will tell you how winters used to end. Borrow a library book from a small town and discover a faint ribbon of perfume that belongs to an unhurried reader from 1983. Walk past a jazz club and realize that even when the past has technically been outlawed, it keeps paying the cover charge. The ashtray, once a table's heavy punctuation, now lives in antique shops beside butter molds and bottle openers, relics of evenings when conversations had intermissions. Some nights you can spot a meerschaum pipe in a window and watch it, darken slightly as if remembering. The story is less about sin than about pacing. Tobacco taught whole continents to exhale on purpose, then taught them to argue about the consequences, then taught them again to negotiate time 5 minutes behind the shop, 10 minutes on the back steps, 1 long hour on a porch where the mosquitoes have opinions. It began as holy breath and became global habit, then scandal, then policy, then the embarrassed persistence of any practice that once explained the day. Even the bands come and go like weather fronts. The leaf is patient, in ways borders are not. If you've drifted at any point, good. That means the smoke did its old work without burning a single thing. If not, you can rest here where the ember is small and the room is quiet, and the history, which has learned to speak softly, keeps telling itself at a volume no louder than your own breath. Somewhere a curing barn exhales last summer's heat. Somewhere a lab notebook has very careful handwriting. Somewhere on a balcony with plants and terracotta pots, and the city explaining itself in neon. Someone holds a lighter like a question and then decides not to ask it. The air remembers everything and forgives most of it. The evening stretches, unhurried as ash. And the breath you're taking now, the simple one, is the best part, going out as calmly as it came in, like a story choosing to end by gently never ending. You might not expect a leaf to teach people how to breathe on purpose, but tobacco did, in rooms where the air learned politeness and time slowed down enough to look at itself. In the oldest accounts, it isn't a vice or even a hobby. It's a small weather event in a bowl, moving at the speed of a sigh. A healer pinches the dried leaf the way a librarian handles a delicate page. Fire is introduced with ceremony, not urgency coals coaxed from the communal hearth. A twig with ambitions, a spark carefully encouraged like a guest at a shy wedding. Smoke rises, then remembers it is supposed to wander toward the 4 directions. Because the 4 directions, like elderly relatives, appreciate a greeting. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you're welcome to subscribe. If you're already drifting, that's also excellent customer engagement. In those early lodges, the pipe was not a gadget, so much as a seat at the table, a stem of reed. Or wood, a stone or clay bowl warmed just enough to release whatever the leaf had been thinking about all summer. The bowl sometimes had a face, which was not ornamental but supervisory. In small circles, the bowl went around and speech slowed. To match. It was not about smoke in the chest. It was about the chest remembering it had room. When hunters asked for luck, they borrowed the pipe to tell the animals they were serious about gratitude. When the animals did not show, there was discussion, not complaint. Naming ceremonies used smoke as punctuation. The names were said, then the bowl confirmed them in a small cloud that made everything official in the way stamp, ink, and wax seal once did. People listed all the things smoke could politely influence, and the list grew like a family tree. Clerk had stopped updating. Stubborn grief, chronic worrying, knees that had learned to argue, dreams that refused to be on time. Shamans sent smoke through water to make the water less nervous. Midwives gave it a task guard the doorway, and stop anyone from entering who didn't know the song. Bowls were cleaned with a seriousness usually reserved for heirloom butter molds. There were rules, which is to say there was tenderness. Not during a storm. Thunder dislikes competition. Not over a cradle unless an elder asked the leaf to behave. Always offer a pinch to the ground before your own lips. The ground is old. It has earned first taste. When people say magic, what they often mean is choreography with good manners. Tobacco participated in chants that didn't rhyme because the point was not rhyme, but remembering which step leads to which. It shared company with sage and sweetgrass. A team of botanicals operating like kindly bureaucrats. Stamp here. Initial there. Now please take this blessing to the west wall. Small pouches of leaf were carried the way we carry phone chargers, just in case the day ran long. If you picture it, make the room dim and kind, with light through the doorway like a lazy slice of milk. Imagine a coal the size of a thumb insisting, with quiet authority, that everyone take turns. Imagine time agreeing and then actually doing it. At some point, the ocean volunteered itself, the way oceans do when they feel left out. Caravels with rib cages of stubborn wood carried bales that smelled like sunlight that had been talked to. Fold. Sailors on night watch learned that a pipe makes the horizon less repetitive. A pull from a stem did not change the sea, but it did place a railing between the sailor and his thoughts, which is an improvement nearly anywhere. When those ships slouched into old world harbors, smoke disembarked with a humble confidence. Of a cat who knows exactly which chair is new, apothecaries sold it in twisty papers with claims that would now require footnotes. A physician recommended it for memory and then immediately misplaced his notes, which proves either nothing or everything. Courts adopted the leaf with the speed of a fad that keeps turning into a habit. A duke kept a pipe long enough it almost became a relative. A queen held the bowl like a scepter that had learned to relax. Portrait painters discovered that a faint curl of smoke stabilized a composition the way a small dog stabilizes a family photo. Snuff crossed the threshold from medicine to decoration, and men practiced pinching powdered leaf with the concentration of jewelers. Snuff boxes winked from pockets like tame meteorites. Some had tiny mirrors in the lid in case your dignity wanted supervision. You took a pinch, you sneezed into a handkerchief so embroidered it could get published, and then you said splendid, because splendid was the appropriate temperature of approval. When something becomes common, a ban develops almost automatically, like condensation on a glass. A city prohibited smoking in churches on the grounds that the incense was jealous. A monastery adopted a rule that permitted tobacco only on days ending with a Y, which looked strict on parchment and less strict in practice. A sultan threatened noses, which are never at fault but are always available, and the court historian wrote, with admirable restraint, that the measure was unpopular. A pope frowned, unfrowned, and frowned again after listening to different cheerful advisors. A king issued a proclamation that smelled suspiciously like his own pipe. Bans failed, and smoke learned geography. It memorized courtyards, back steps, rooms labeled not this one, and the precise time frame during which a watchdog takes a nap. Fields had to reorganize their ambitions. Land that once entertained many crops learned to host one, and rose as disciplined as marching bands. Curing barns blinked in autumn light, walls slatted for a draft that might as well have been called patience. Leaves hung like laundry that had recently joined a monastery. They turned from green to the color of late afternoon and kept on drying until they sounded like paper thinking about itself. The economy arrived with notebooks and walked along the rows, counting. Labor arrived under pressure, and the counting got louder. A bale strapped tight became a unit, then a shipment, then a ledger entry with a personality. Triangles appeared on maps, goods here, people there, money everywhere else, and the leaf, which had not asked for any of this, continued quietly. Being a leaf, meanwhile the instruments multiplied and became affectionate nuisances. Clay pipes in taverns stood in racks like polite umbrellas. Meerschaum bowls absorbed color and grew handsome the way old paper grows brave. Water pipes bubbled like kitchens practicing soup. The Japanese kisuryu performed the sentence of smoking with grammar, a pinch, a short puff, a deliberate exhale, like a haiku that keeps correcting your posture. In West Africa, the calabash pipe looked like furniture that had chosen to be portable. Some pipes had stems so long they were less pipes than policies. They required planning, a chair with arms, and an afternoon generous enough to be mistaken for a weekend. Embers became clocks. Tampers became punctuation. And Ash, the neatest accountant in the room, kept minutes without ever requesting a raise. Snuff decided to become an art form. There were ram's head moles for crushing it, their horns silver-tipped like punctuation marks. There were snuff spoons, small enough to serve a single grain to a single nostril, which is the sort of precision that makes future generations smile. Etiquette authors debated the correct hand to sneeze into, and the even more correct handkerchief to deploy afterward. A Persian perfumer sold a blend that promised to smell like victory, but delivered a credible impression of violets that had attended finishing school. A Scottish club voted a moment of respect for a gentleman who inhaled too ambitiously. The secretary took minutes with an expression that can only be described as dignified sympathy. You can still picture the sneeze as a kind of civic participation. Cigars drifted in and created afternoons. They were patient sentences rolled from whole leaves, and men in linen discovered that the ash tower, if treated kindly, could grow to the length of an entire anecdote. Later, cigarettes arrived like very small decisions that repeat. Factories rolled them at a tempo that made the century seem busy even when it wasn't. Posters insisted on glamour, as if glamour were a cousin of health. A camel strolled across a billboard with the posture of a headline. A cowboy stared at a horizon that looked suspiciously like the back wall of a studio. For a while, physicians in white coats composed friendly collaborations with advertisements in black ink, the world's most polite disagreement between lab and lobby. Laboratories eventually sharpened their pencils. Lungs and jars were studied by people fond of lists. Smokers were counted, then non-smokers were counted, then non-smokers who lived with smokers were counted because fairness is a habit. Charts began shy and then became choirs. Lines rose on newsprint like hills that had done this sort of thing before. The leaf answered back with filters, then filter tips, then filters that promised to be almost moral. Menthol meant with an advanced degree promised the cool of a lake at evening. Statistics continued their professional obligation to be boring and decisive at the same time. A committee drafted the sentence, "may be hazardous," a phrase so careful, it practically requested tea. Another committee enlarged the font. And then, like a particularly elegant thundercloud, the warning label finally discovered caps lock. Public rooms reoriented themselves around air the way kitchens reorient around a sink. Train compartments divided into carriages that disagreed. Restaurants invented zones with the conviction of cosmologists. A line of tape on the floor performed miracles for exactly 10 minutes. Airplanes updated the little sign that used to switch off at altitude. Later, planes installed a version of the sign that never turned off, solving the debate by removing the switch. Cities passed laws that imagined weather could read. In response, culture invented the sidewalk heater and the balcony conversation. People began stepping outside to catch up with themselves. Breath turned visible in winter and used this opportunity to show off rhythm. Then electricity knocked and said, "I hear you enjoy vapor." Batteries the size of courteous pens warmed little coils that produced plumes flavored like desserts with university educations. Dragon fruit and custard auditioned for the role of Tuesday. Debates refreshed themselves. Is this harm less, or harm relocated, or harm renamed? Is the laboratory satisfied? Is the lobby satisfied? Is your uncle satisfied? Magazines printed diagrams with arrows that explained everything without asking anyone to feel differently. The market, which loves hobbies that fit in pockets, approved. The ashtray, once a heavy punctuation mark on every table, retired to antique shops, where it now stands between butter molds and bottle openers like a former celebrity trying to look ordinary. Culture keeps its artifacts even when it changes its mind about them. Open a suitcase from your grandfather, and the lining will explain how winter smelled. Borrow a library book from a small town and find a ribbon of old smoke stubbornly lodged in the binding. The scent of evenings that like to loiter. Some jazz. Clubs can't help sounding better with a remembered haze, even when the haze is only theoretical and crafted by stage lights. A meerschaum pipe in a window darkens every year, like something that has been keeping quiet on purpose. People still gather to not smoke together, which is to say to lean against door frames and narrate their week while their hands play with lighters, like rosary beads that forgot to be religious doubt if the story has an argument. It's small and patient. Tobacco taught entire societies the ritual of the pause, first as holy breath, then as habit, then as scandal, then as policy, then as embarrassment, and finally as a set of negotiations you can watch in any doorway at 10 past the hour. It is neither simple villain nor secret saint. It is a leaf that people invited into their calendars. The leaf, for its part, remained steadfastly vegetal. It dried, it burned, it perfumed, it financed, it harmed, it consoled, it lingered in curtains in choir lofts and on the wool shoulders of coats that went everywhere. The doctors, meanwhile, continued counting. They counted kindly, which is how doctors prefer to count. A file folder labeled denial thickened and then, rather suddenly, retired. Warning labels made friends with multilingual verbs. In some countries, packages began to behave like billboards. For caution, staging little posters of unpleasant truth. People tried quitting on Mondays. Mondays accepted this responsibility with heroic composure. Patches taught skin to be brave. Gum practiced pep talks and peppermint. Support groups experimented with chairs and circles and the polite therapy of biscuits. Stories emerged of first cigarettes, last cigarettes, and the surprising quality of air on a stairwell after lunch dot and still. When the evening leans toward quiet, there are echoes. A porch remembers the precise spot where a friend always sat. A bench knows how to host a conversation with long gaps between sentences. A field that grew tobacco has a talent for golden light in September, which is not science but seems consistent. The old language persists in surprising corners. Cheroot, cigar, snuff mull, kisseroo, meerschaum, calabash words that clink like little brass fittings in a drawer. If you're still listening and not entirely asleep, that drawer is where we will set them down, gently as if they could bruise. We end where the leaf began, with breath. In the lodges of long ago, it was called sacred smoke because breath itself was sacred and needed a visible companion. Today the companion has changed. Occupations, but breath continues as it always has, making poems without trying. Pull the air in, let it go out. No label required, no band necessary, no gadget for your pocket. If you've drifted, excellent. The story has done its old job without catching fire. If you haven't, you can rest here anyway, in a room where ash is only a metaphor, and the ember is a dot of soft red punctuation at the end of a sentence that chooses, very kindly, not to end.